Hello BookTube! Today I want to discuss with you the novel Out of Darkness Shining Light by Petina Gappah. So Gappah is a Zimbabwean author. Out of Darkness Shining Light is her second novel, although to be honest I'd never heard of her before. And she also has two short story collections. And apart from being a novelist, she is a lawyer specializing in international trade and investments. She lived in Geneva, Switzerland for a while, according to the blurb at the frontier, but currently lives again in Harare in Zimbabwe. And Out of Darkness Shining Light is a novel about the last voyage of David Livingstone, or rather his mortal remains. For those who don't know, Livingstone died in what is now Zambia during his final expedition to find the source of the Nile, or attempt to find the source of the Nile. And after his death, his heart was buried in the village where he was born, but the rest of his body was preserved and brought back to the coast by his servants, and from there brought back to England so he could be buried in Westminster Abbey. Now, if you hear the description, you might think that this is an adventure story, but it's very much not. It is in fact a character study. It's although of course you follow Livingstone's body, or the journey taken by Livingstone's body, but it's very much about African servants who carried the body and who accompanied Livingstone on his last journey. And like I said, it's a character study, so it's really about getting to know all these people, and Livingstone himself and the journey itself kind of takes a back seat. And to do that, the story is narrated to us through two narrators. There's Halima, a former slave, who was bought or hired, it's very murky, by Livingstone, and then taken with him on his journey to be his cook. And the second part of the book is narrated in the form of a diary by Jacob Wainwright, who was, as a boy, sold into slavery by his uncle, but as he was being shipped from East Africa to Oman, the ship carrying him was intercepted by the British Navy, and he was taken, set free, but taken to India to a missionary school there to be educated, and then he later came back to accompany first Stanley and then the Livingstone expedition. Related to that, I recently saw an interesting video in the channel Books by Lanes about Gloria Naylor, and the point she makes there is that it was one of the few books she's read about African Americans in that case, where it's really only about black people and their lives aren't set off against the presence of white people in the very least. And thinking back to something I noticed in a lot of African books, right? So, of course, in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, of course, the coming of colonialism, the coming of white people is very much part of the point of the book. But also, for example, in Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun, we have a white main character. In The Old Drift by Nomani Chappelle, we have white main characters. And even in, for example, Welcome to Lagos, although all the characters there are black, but still there's a tangible influence of white people and of the white world on society, right? There's the Norwegian embassy plays a role, the BBC plays a role, much more than Africa plays a role in any book set in contemporary Britain, for example. And in fact, one of the few books where I remember being very little role of kind of white people in the Western world is actually Kintu. So, and to highlight even further, I think the nice quote that summarizes it is why you can't get away from white people, so to say, is at the start of The Old Drift, where Chappelle writes, "This is the story of a nation, not a kingdom or a people, so it begins, of course, with a white man." Which very much summarizes the influence that white people, the Western world, have had in shaping how Africa is now. And so, of course, if you write a story about a white explorer, Livingstone, who kind of spearheaded the coming of white people in that sense, it's unavoidable to have, that influence your story, but at the same time, Gappah really manages to push that to the background, right? So Livingston is of course there. I mean, the whole purpose of this journey for these people to come together is to accompany Livingston and later to bring his body back to the coast. But the book is very much more about getting to know these people that were in the party of Livingston, and getting to see them as living people and with their own dreams and ambitions and hopes. And Livingston himself kind of just gets pushed off to the background, right? Ironically, and I'm sure intentionally, kind of in the way that the black people who assisted Livingston, who carried all his stuff and who navigated for him and helped protect him from hostile people or hostile wildlife, in the same way that all of those usually get pushed back into the background when it's about the journeys of Livingston. So it's very nice to kind of see that reversal. And okay, realizing I haven't actually told you what I thought of the book yet. I absolutely love this book. It was really great, and it's really great how Gappah kind of created these two characters, Halima and Jack Wainwright, to tell us the story in two very completely different characters with very different voices, right, and who really come alive. And so, for one example, Halima, so as I said, the cook. One point she hears that David Livingston, or Bwana Dowdy, Master David as she calls him, mentioned that she didn't know the difference between tea and coffee. And then this is what she tells us, right? Because it really feels like you're having a conversation with her as you're reading her sections of the story. I went to Bwana Dowdy at once, though it was the hour of his ablutions and he was preparing to go to the river. And I would not let him leave his hut. And indeed, I said to him, you forget that I was the daughter of the cook in the Liwali's kitchen, who was also Surya in his harem, and we had all sorts of tea there, I can tell you that for nothing. Tea served with mint and cinnamon, and coffee too, like you have never smelled. From Arabia it was, from Abyssinia too. He was an Omani of the first rank, wasn't he? I said to Bwana Dowdy, ugly though he was, the Liwali. He was an important man with a house in Changani Point, bursting with silks and spices and slaves and all sorts of tea and coffee we had in the stores and much more besides. It is all anyone can do to tell what is what, when it is all jumbled together any which way in all these old tins, I said. This is not a proper kitchen, this jungle and forest, these 3 stone fires. And yes, I said to him, my mother, who was the Surya of the Sultan's Liwali as well as his cook, told me that there are people in Oman, wild people who live in the mountains, who can cook chickens or even a whole goat like nothing you have ever seen on hot trucks with nothing added but salt. But I am no mountain person from Oman, I am not. I am just Halima, and it is nothing more than I can do to produce a feast out of rocks and salt and nothing. And he laughed and said, Halima, he said, but you have an outrageous tongue, and continued laughing as he walked down the river to his ablutions. I shouted after him, you can say what you will about my tongue, and you will not be the first either, nor the last if it comes to that. It is what it is, my tongue is, but I will not have my character taken away from me, that I will not. Bwana or no Bwana, or else I am not the daughter of Zafrena. Not know the difference between tea and coffee, indeed. Right, so, like I said, so Halima rarely becomes alive. Jacob Wainwright a little less, but that's because in Wainwright's case, we're reading through a medium of his diary, whereas Halima is established as being illiterate, so she really speaks to us as if we were really talking to her. But you can see that in this way, Gappah really, gives these people a voice, makes them come alive, and through Halima and Wainwright, we get to meet the rest of the party as well, and get to see them from different angles, and really see them as real people with their own independent existence. And it's also interesting that all the chapters in Halima's first part start with a little excerpt from Livingston's diaries. I'm not entirely sure if they're fictionalized or not. I mean, Livingston's diaries have been published, but I'm not entirely sure if these are literal extracts, but I think they are. Where Gappah is kind of imagining the backstory, which hasn't been mentioned. What is happening behind these words that Livingston wrote down himself. Yeah, although you might, having heard all this, you might say, okay, think that this is an anti-colonial book, and I think it definitely is, or post-colonial book anyway. The book itself is quite subtle in its political messaging. And I think in part that's because of the choice of narrator. And so there's a very explicit choice for two narrators who are very limited in time and scope, right? So they live at the start of European colonialism, so they, or at least let's say the scramble for Africa phase of European colonialism. So they can't really see into the future exactly what's going to happen. There's actually only one character who correctly kind of foretells what's going to come, and I won't spoil what happens to him. But you know, especially Halima, who hasn't had much education, doesn't know much about the world, has kind of a very narrow view of things. And also Jacob Wainwright, in his own way, is a somewhat narrow view of things. So you kind of have to, you know, the main thing the book does is give these people a voice. But if you start thinking, there's a lot of like subtle things going on in the background, right? So like the way, you know, wherever Livingstone goes, there are already like people living there in established civilizations, right? It's not just kind of people running naked through the forest, or no people at all. You know, there are, you know, villages and settlements and trade routes, right? And although Livingstone might not go exactly where he's going, and although people might not know what the source of the Nile is, primarily because they don't really care about such things. You know, the river is there. Who cares where it exactly comes from or goes to? But it's not a new, undiscovered country that Livingstone is traveling through, right? It's new to him, but not to the people who've been living there. And the other thing is we have especially the character of Jacob Wainwright. So Wainwright, as I said, is taken to a missionary school in India as a young child and is educated there, and he becomes very zealous. So he's right, this the kind of fits the stereotype of, you know, the convert who's even more zealous about their beliefs than, you know, people that have grown up in whatever religion. And so at first he's very excited to be traveling with, you know, Livingstone, this great man, this great missionary, and Wainwright's own hope is to, you know, bring the light of Christ to the dark continent of Africa and convert everyone. And then he becomes gradually more and more disappointed as he sees Livingstone actually not living up to these ideals that he had of him, right? So, you know, Livingstone hardly goes around converting anyone, right? He has Muslims in his party and he doesn't try to, you know, get them to follow the right path. How can this be? So Wainwright kind of points out the hypocrisy behind the whole European colonialist project, you know, when they said, you know, it was the white man's burden and we're coming to bring civilization. But without actually voicing that as a political statement in the novel, right? So it's, if you are completely oblivious, you could just read this as, you know, just an interesting, you know, character study novel, and I think you would enjoy just that. But if you, you know, just start thinking about it a little, you kind of start seeing all these things without the novel ever having to become preachy about it or explicitly lay this out for you, which I think is a really great achievement. Yes, all in all, like I said, hugely enjoyed this novel. Highly recommend it if you are at all interested in reading some books by African authors and want to get away from, you know, the big name classics that you've heard about, or especially, you know, there's lots of Nigerian authors becoming more and more popular, which of course is great, but there's more to Africa than just Nigeria, so it's nice to hear a voice from a different part of Africa. And, you know, even if you're not interested in the themes of the novel, if you just want to spend some time with some great characters and get to know some people far removed from us in both time and space, this is a great way to do that. If you've read this novel or have any other thoughts about it, please leave your comments down below, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.